The year is 1937, and after years of creating animated shorts, Walt Disney Productions would release Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. While animation existed for decades before, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is given the crown for numerous groundbreaking firsts. The first animated feature film, the first full-colored animated feature, and with that, the first feature film to utilize celluloid animation. Celluloid animation, or cel animation, was invented in 1915 by Earl Hurd and John Bray, and would go on to become the most widely used animation process for the rest of the century. The technique they invented in explanation is quite simple. First, a background is created, often painted on a simple piece of paper. Next, the subject, usually a character or object in motion, is sketched onto paper. This sketch is then copied to a clear celluloid sheet where it is then painted. Lastly, this now painted celluloid sheet is laid atop the background, creating the scene. When photographed, this becomes a single frame of animation, meaning that for every animated feature, every cartoon, anything that used cel animation, for each frame of movement, that piece exists, or existed, in a physical form, made entirely by hand. Tonight, we're going to be discussing cel animation, from its history to its eventual decline, and possibly the most unique aspect of cel animation, the fact that you could own a handmade, screen-used piece of your favorite show or movie. So, grab a snack, get comfy. This is gonna be a not-so-long video. Let's get started. In the 1930s, motion picture was in its golden age, though, ironically, at this pivotal moment in the history of one of humanity's most important art forms, it was seen as anything but art. Film was entertainment, and little else. A film would be created, shown across the country, and shelved in the studio's storage room, often neglected, and, in some cases, intentionally destroyed. They had served their use, made the studio their money, and that was that. The survival of any film was more often than not in the hands of the studio, and film takes up space. A lot of space. And space costs money. In the few cases where studios did keep their films, improper storage led to rapid deterioration. Be it the silver nitrate film used before the 1950s or the acetate film that preceded it, both are prone to deterioration if not kept in an ideal, climate-controlled environment. While we can never truly know how many films are lost forever, it's estimated that well over 80% of every film made before the 1930s are lost, and will never be seen again. A major reason for this, apart from the deterioration, was fire. Silver nitrate film was incredibly flammable. An entire roll of film could be gone in seconds, and sadly, this was the cause of two of the biggest tragedies in art preservation history. The 1937 Fox Vault Fire and the 1965 MGM Vault Fire. Both of these fires destroyed hundreds, possibly thousands of silent and early sound films, many of which were the only known copies to exist. Most famously lost would be the 1927 silent horror film London After Midnight, starring Lon Chaney. With the last known print of the movie being destroyed in the 1965 MGM fire, it has since become one of the most famous examples of a lost film, and one that both historians and fans alike hope to potentially find one day. And these hopes aren't entirely lost, as the discovery of films once considered lost have been found in private collections. There's even a possibility that such sought-after pieces of film history could be sitting in some storage unit or antique store somewhere just waiting to be found. Many lost scenes from the legendary 1927 sci-fi film Metropolis have been found and re-implemented into the version of the film that we see today. Scenes that simply didn't exist in early copies of the film have brought it a few steps closer to being complete, though some scenes still remain missing. Hundreds of films that were once considered entirely lost have also been found throughout the decades, with some of these lost films dating back to the 1890s, and with the largest majority being from that pivotal era of the 1920s and 30s. With preservation of film becoming a much more serious endeavor, more and more of these films are being discovered and protected every year. Now, what does all of this have to do with cel animation? Well, animation is still ultimately on film. Snow White, just like every other film made before the switch to acetate, was just as prone to being lost forever in a single fire. Animation, however, also exists physically, at least in regards to cel animation. These cels and backgrounds make up every frame you see when watching a cel animated movie or show. That means, in every instance of movement, a cel was created by hand. In regards to an animated feature film, hundreds of thousands of cels would have been made. For the production of Snow White, an estimated 362,000 cels were created to bring the film to life. For much of animation's history, the tools used to bring the project to its final form were merely that, tools, and the painted cels and backgrounds filling every frame were seen as no different. Cels were created, photographed for the scene, maybe kept around for a short while just in case a reshoot was needed, and ultimately neglected. While it's stated Disney has indeed kept the cels used in the creation of their early works, it's truly impossible to know for sure. The existence of some of these cels are known, as some of these studios have given rare glimpses into their archives. However, the extent of preservation and care that's given to these works is largely unknown. You see, cels followed the same progression as film stock, starting early with the incredibly flammable silver nitrate and moving on to acetate stock in later years. Simply put, film stock and celluloid sheets used in animation are the exact same material, and with that, both fall victim to the fragile nature of these materials. Both need to be held within a specific temperature and humidity, need to be allowed to breathe, and cannot be exposed to UV light. And even when kept in ideal conditions, if the process of deterioration has started, there's very little that can be done in order to stop it. The biggest signal of a film or cel falling victim to deterioration is known as vinegar syndrome. As its name implies, once a film or cel has started giving off a vinegar-like scent, there's very little that can be done to reverse this process. The film or cel will begin to warp, and in some cases shrink, which can damage the image painted on the cel, or cause film to become brittle and unusable. Apart from the deterioration of the celluloid, the paint and image itself is also prone to their own damage, mostly from UV exposure or simply improper care. Leaving a cel directly attached to a background or even the sketch sheet that the cel is based on can result in a common phenomenon known simply as sticking. Over time, the paint applied to the backs of cels can adhere to surfaces that they're placed against, resulting in permanent damage to the cel itself, the sketch sheet, or the background. Once this happens, removing the cel can be difficult, and damage to either the cel, or more often the background or sketch sheet, is almost guaranteed. Assuming companies like Disney kept every single cel used in every single production, and Snow White's use of 362,000 cels for its hour and 23-minute runtime, that would mean there are millions of cels that each need to be taken care of properly, kept separate from their sketch sheets or backgrounds, and also not stored in a stack on top of each other to avoid sticking. The point I'm getting at is, while the films themselves may be preserved and still exist, the cels and backgrounds created are neglected, scattered, or most likely not being maintained in a way that ensures their longevity. As someone who loves art, I consider the original cels of these legendary works to be on the same level of importance as the most famous paintings in history, yet they don't appear to be treated with that same level of respect, except for by a very small group of individuals. I can find numerous articles on Disney preserving original negatives of their films, which is indeed important, but can find zero information on exactly which of these original works of art have been kept, because the answer is certainly not all of them. How do I know that? Well, simple. I own a cel from one of Disney's productions. This one in particular was sold by the Disney company, which means, at least to a minor degree, they don't care about keeping all of the cels in their archives. Now, granted, Oliver & Company isn't the most prestigious of Disney's animated catalog, but that's just in regards to what I personally own. There are many listings online of cels from The Little Mermaid, The Jungle Book, Alice in Wonderland. There are even cels from Bambi, Pinocchio, even Snow White listed for sale, some of Disney's oldest films, and, well, the state of some of these cels certainly reflects their age. The fact that these cells have been released to the public is bittersweet. As a cell collector, I'm honored to own these original pieces. These single moments that last a mere fraction of a second on screen represent moments from our childhood that we all experienced, and these cells are those moments. Anytime someone watches The Little Mermaid on Disney Plus, or streams an episode of The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, or goes to a movie theater to see an event screening of Perfect Blue, they're watching thousands of hand-drawn images in rapid succession, simply being placed over a background, photographed, and replaced with the next. There's so much significance in each frame, and yet they're only a fraction of the whole film. To be able to own that is an amazing feeling, and sometimes I just love to stop and admire the pieces I have in my collection. What they represent, the fact that they are the original work that has been viewed by millions of people, it's a feeling that's hard to put into words. I say it's bittersweet because of what goes into the preservation of these cells. Once you make the purchase, the cell is yours, and it then becomes your responsibility to care for it, if you even care to the extent of which some in the community expect. Cells are works of art. They're quite literally paintings and are truly the original. You can own statues representing characters that you love, you can collect merchandise, but it really doesn't get much closer to the character or property than owning a cell that was used in the production, at least when they're available. Cells are tangible pieces, and as mentioned previously, are tools to the studios creating these animated productions. A large majority of animated films and TV series up to the late 1990s, and in some cases early 2000s, used cells, and with that, there's a lot to be discussed. I think it's best to start with the value and rarity of cells. It goes without saying that the more popular the subject, the more expensive a cell would be, which does track in most cases. For example, cells from Pokemon are incredibly expensive and a bit on the rarer side, especially considering how many episodes and movies the series had traditionally animated. A large majority of Pokemon cells are listed for thousands of dollars, and quite a few have sold around the $1,000 to $2,000 price range. Another series that's quite popular that also had many cells made for it is Sailor Moon. However, somehow many more cells from Sailor Moon are available, and the prices are usually much more reasonable. So, what's the deal? With a series as popular as Pokemon, you'd think more cells would be out there, but this all comes down to one thing: what the studios that created these series did with their cells. As I mentioned a while back, storing animation cells, the sketches associated with them, and backgrounds isn't easy and requires a lot of storage space. Once an episode is entirely photographed and put to film, that is the final product. To the studio, that is what all the work was for. It wasn't for any single frame of animation individually, it was for a complete episode, and once that episode was complete, well, oftentimes the studios didn't really care what happened to the cells. Some studios are known to have sold cells at conventions, given them away as prizes, or through other various means. Some studios kept only key cells and disposed of others. Some studios threw all of them away. It's also known that some individual animators took some for themselves, most likely ones that they worked on or that were particularly important to them. In retrospect, it's easy for us to wonder how anyone could think a cell from some of the most important animated properties could be disposed of, just like how many collectibles of the past have only become that way because of the scarcity these relics now hold. I doubt any of the animators working on Pokemon thought a single cell of Ash, Brock, and Misty, the three characters with the most screen time, who appear in virtually every single episode, would sell for thousands of dollars. Or the animator who worked at Disney in 1935, who painted this cell from the early Mickey Mouse cartoon, The Band Concert. This single cell was sold privately for a reported $420,000 in 1999, 64 years after it was made. Though people have been collecting animation cells for quite some time, it appears the community just keeps growing, and most of us have the same story. We had no idea it was possible to own these fragments of our favorite movies and shows. Most of us didn't even know what cell animation even really was before getting into it. When you do, you realize it's quite an expensive hobby, and everyone collects in different ways and for different reasons. Most of us are on the same page about one thing. These are all works of art and need to be preserved as best as possible. The most diehard of collectors will put their Cels in a portfolio, with each cell, sketch sheet, and background entirely separated, stored away in a climate-controlled environment, only taken out to be enjoyed as they wish. This is certainly a valid means of collecting, and I respect it very much. If I had the self-control to do so, I would, but there's something about seeing these works of art every day that appeals to me personally. I have a handful of my many Cels framed on a wall in a hallway in my home, and have my own way of framing the Cels to protect and preserve them to the best of my ability, which includes doing away with the traditional frame backing and instead using non-acidic rice paper sleeves made for vinyl records, due to their ability to breathe. Since Cels need to be able to breathe to avoid deterioration, I find this to be a suitable method, but will also remove them from their frames to allow the Cels to breathe naturally, usually every other month. Also, UV blocking glass is a must, and should be considered the bare minimum. If you want to put a Cel in a plastic Walmart frame, I can't stop you, but it may lead to faster deterioration. Some in the community may consider any sort of framing to be a sin against preservation, and I get it, but from my research, especially when looking into Cels that are nearly 100 years old that have been shown in exhibits, so long as care goes into it, your Cels will hold up just fine whether they're framed or not. You just simply need to be mindful of the conditions of the room they're in. Sometimes when I'm walking through my hallway, I love to just stop and look at these pieces, some of which come from my favorite episodes or movies. I love to admire the small details that went into them, and I don't think I'd look at them nearly as often if they were in a portfolio. To all of you who keep your Cel collections in portfolios, I have the highest respect. It seems as though collectibles of all kinds are becoming more and more popular as time goes on. Video game collecting, card collecting, vinyl record collecting, the collecting of various media formats, there are expensive, holy grail quality pieces to all of these hobbies, and when there's money to be made, someone's bound to try to make $1 off people new to the hobby who find that deal that's too good to be true. Cel collecting is no different. Reproduction Cels are very common, and while some sellers will say whether or not the Cel is a reproduction, to varying degrees of clarity, others will outright lie and even add production notes to the Cel to make it appear as if it's real. Production notes are often applied to the top corner of a Cel during their creation to ensure they're ordered correctly in sequence, as well as to indicate what scene they're used in. The thing about collecting animation Cels is that you can never truly know for certain that your Cel is the original one, unless they came directly from the studio with proof. The odds of someone replicating a between-frame Cel where a character's eyes are half closed, or a Cel that barely resembles the character, are significantly low, but they're not zero. The true Cels you need to watch out for are of iconic moments. Cels of instantly recognizable scenes are going to be expensive, and the way I see it, are most likely already in private collections or kept in archives. Unlike cards or vinyl records, which have step-by-step guides to indicating authenticity, Cels are always done by hand, and there's only one. That means if a reproduction is ever made, the only thing you can compare it to is the original, and if it's not documented on one of the few Cel collectors' gallery sites, determining whether a Cel is original or not could be impossible. You can also take the Cel and find the exact frame that the Cel is from and compare it. Doing this is kind of like those side-by-side spot the differences pictures. I came across a Kiki's Delivery Service Cel, which is one of my personal grails, that looked too good to be true. It had no production notes on it, but was a Cel that could reasonably exist. Again, Cels of iconic moments or instantly recognizable scenes are the most commonly faked, and this was neither of those, but the absence of the production notes was what kept me from buying it. The seller even tried passing it off as an original production piece, and someone even ended up buying it. I feel really bad for whoever purchased the Cel, as it could be a frustrating experience and an expensive mistake to make, one that I myself have almost made a few times. For example, this Cel popped up on eBay while I was making this video. Look at that, if the seller is to be believed, this was sold for only 620 yen sometime in the 90s, which is just insane. But is it real? Well, I don't know, so I went ahead and bought it myself. I've been lucky enough to come in contact with a cell collector and seller who lives in Japan, who's been of great help in authenticating pieces, and after receiving it, they were able to help authenticate it, at least to the best of our abilities, because again, the guarantee of authenticity is rarely ever 100%. Much like many old cells, this one is stuck to its sketch sheet, or Genga as it's known in Japan. As mentioned previously, once this happens, separating the cell from the Genga is nearly impossible without damaging either the cell, the Genga, or both. Some techniques exist that many claim will ease the process of separation, such as putting a stuck cell in a freezer, which I've tried before and didn't have any results that I felt comfortable proceeding with, so I tend to just leave them as is if I receive a stuck cell. This also applies to cells that come with their original background, as cells will often stick to this as well. Animation backgrounds are also hand-painted and are just as much works of art as the cells themselves, but we'll get more into that later. If I receive a cell that isn't stuck but would like to keep the Genga behind the cell, I'll take a bag meant for the storing of Life magazines, cut them up a bit, and place the cell inside this first. These are acid-free and should be a healthy home for your cell to live. Just make sure to remove it a few times a year to air it out, if you're so inclined. Some collectors will also use microchamber paper, which is said to absorb the gases that are naturally expelled from the celluloid material, simply replacing it periodically as an extra step for preservation, acting as a filter of sorts. All of these steps and guidelines sounds like a lot, but once you own a cell, it's yours to do with as you please. While I strongly believe these pieces should be protected and preserved, even I can't bring myself not to frame some of my favorite pieces, which, again, many collectors consider to be a sin of cell preservation. Animation backgrounds are much easier to maintain, as they're simply painted pieces of paper and are truly beautiful and works of art in their own right. Backgrounds, however, often get separated from the cells they were once paired with, resulting in a strange phenomenon where cells will get sold with backgrounds that don't even come from the same series. Though this video is about cell collecting, backgrounds are often included with them, so I'd be remiss to not at least talk about them a little bit. Considering multiple cells will use the same background, that means cells highly outnumber the amount of backgrounds that exist in any given series. And though I don't see as many people out there prioritizing backgrounds over cells, some of these are simply beautiful, and I'm always on the lookout for backgrounds to certain series like Macross or Evangelion. In my time collecting animation cells, I've received multiple backgrounds that I don't know the origin of, and probably never will. Tracking down what a background is from is oftentimes much more difficult than the cell itself, for obvious reasons, though many sellers do sell mystery cells in which they have no idea what the source may be. Cells were used in everything from animated commercials to the least watched cartoons forgotten by history, so it makes sense for some of these cells to be from series that have since been forgotten by time. One such series is Sailor Moon. Oh no, not the Sailor Moon that is one of the most influential properties on the planet, I'm talking about this Sailor Moon. In the early 1990s, before Sailor Moon would make its way to Western shores, animation production company Toon Makers would attempt to localize Sailor Moon for Western audiences, and their first attempt was a complete reconstruction of the series from the ground up. A 10-minute pilot was created in order to pitch the series to various networks. However, the idea of a complete remake of Sailor Moon would be scrapped in favor of simply dubbing the original Japanese series into English. Toon Maker's Sailor Moon featured not only original animation, but also live-action segments, as the series was going to transition between scenes with the cast as live-action characters going about their school lives, and animated characters fighting against evil forces. For a long time, this pilot was thought to be lost, until finally being uploaded to YouTube in 2022. The original animation cells for the pilot were purchased from a storage unit in 2012, and slowly, these cells would get out into the public, and to this day, you can still find listings of these cells on eBay. There's a lot to this whole Toon Maker's Sailor Moon thing, so if you want more information, check out YouTuber Ray Mona's documentary covering the whole thing. It's a fascinating watch. Raymona is also the one responsible for finding and uploading the pilot, so much of the information and the pilot being watchable today is thanks to her. There have been numerous other instances of deleted scenes and even entire lost animated shows being found thanks to Cels surfacing, such as one short segment from a Season 1 episode of SpongeBob, the only season of the series that was Cel animated, and a scene from the Super Mario World cartoon, among others. So, after all that, maybe some of you may be interested in purchasing a Cel of your own, but what's considered a good price? Well, that's tricky. I can't stress enough that Cels are truly one of a kind. The price of a Cel is often simply what someone is willing to pay. Some Cels have sat on eBay for a long period of time that I personally would consider to be either incredibly overpriced or underpriced, but that's just to me. I bought this perfect blue Cel for a little over $600, which I was amazed any Cel from this movie would cost less than $1,000, simply because of how important the film is, not only to myself, but to anime as a whole. But this Cel sat for under $1,000 for quite some time, and no one else jumped on it, so to some, maybe I overpaid. This Cel from Dragon Ball Z has two of my favorite characters, is from one of my favorite episodes, and one of the most iconic scenes from the season. It was first listed on eBay for $600 and I purchased it immediately. The seller then canceled my payment and informed me that they mispriced the item, relisting it for over $2,000. I watched this Cel like a hawk, still bitter about it getting away. It sat for a few weeks as the seller slowly lowered the price to around $1,200. I messaged them, noticing how often they were lowering the price, and we eventually worked out a deal that we both agreed to. I ended up paying around $800. Did I overpay for that? Well, maybe. Again, Cels are worth whatever someone is willing to pay, and I've still yet to come across another Dragon Ball Cel that means as much to me as this one available on the market, even if overpriced. I purchased this Cel of Vegeta for $300, which I consider to be an excellent price for a Cel of a main character, close up, and with both eyes in the Cel. For some reason, Cels of characters with both eyes in frame always seem to be more desirable than if it's a profile, but sometimes there are really nice profile Cels out there, so maybe that's just a coincidence. I purchased this Cel from Yu Yu Hakusho for only $50, and it has Yusuke, Hiei, and Kurama. It's certainly not a key Cel or anything like that, but for $50, it's hard to pass up any Cel featuring 3 main characters. I have a few Cels from the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, one of which came with a mystery background from some unknown source. I was obsessed with this cartoon as a kid, as well as Sonic Sat AM. Cels from the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog are incredibly easy to find and rather affordable, at least in comparison to other Cels. Cels from Sonic Sat AM, however, are incredibly rare. I've never once seen any come up for sale, and the few that I've seen online have been in private collections. This all comes back to what I was discussing earlier about studios keeping their production material. If a studio ended up destroying them, that's that. They're gone forever, and this is why Cels from certain animations are difficult to find, while there appears to be an abundance of another. In some other universe, we have Sonic Sat AM Cels overflowing on eBay, while the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog Cels are almost entirely lost. Much like the incident with Toon Maker's Sailor Moon, however, there is always a possibility that they're in a storage unit somewhere, and eventually may be found, so there's always hope. Eventually, by the early 2000s, cel animation would die out in favor of digital animation, which is cheaper, easier, and uses way less resources to create. Disney's last animated feature film to use cel animation was The Little Mermaid in 1989, though cel animation would continue to be used for their animated TV series as well as some of the direct-to-video sequels. Also, as a technicality, though The Little Mermaid was indeed the last, it did still use computers in some of its production, so if you'd like to know the last animated film Disney made that was entirely handmade, that would be Oliver & Company, released in 1988. In regards to Japan, Studio Ghibli's last cel animated film would be Princess Mononoke in 1997, and anime would continue to use cel animation until around 2005, though exact dates are difficult to find. The original Fullmetal Alchemist from 2003 was entirely cel animated, while other series like One Piece, which started in 1999, would have initially been cel animated, then transitioned to digital. The anime series Saze-san was the last cel animated series running in Japan, finally switching over to digital in 2013, cementing the end of the cel animation era. The techniques of cel animation still apply to digital in many ways, such as having a background and moving characters along it frame by frame, but much of the nuance is lost. There's a certain life that cel animation brings that seems to be missing in the digital age. That isn't to discredit digital animation. My favorite anime of all time, Puella Magimadoka Magica, was digitally animated, and 3D animation also has its place, and to say that they're entirely void of emotion or passion would simply be false. I think it's safe to say that digital animation does allow for laziness in some ways that wouldn't have been passable if done in the hand-drawn cel generation. But let's not forget that for every instance of Dragon Ball Super having some questionable moments of animation, Dragon Ball Z certainly wasn't perfect either. Ultimately, cel animation and digital animation, when done at its highest level, are both capable of being just as breathtaking and awe-inspiring, and, when used lazily, can lead to poor results. Animation is a timeless art form, and luckily the antiquated misconception that animation is for children is just about dead in modern times. It's funny that this is really only a recent thing, however. The fact that it took this long for general audiences to see that there's animation out there that appeals to every demographic is mind-boggling, but better late than never. Whether cel animation or digital, it all has value, and the techniques learned in the cel animation era have carried over into digital, leaving a legacy of memories and beauty that is still felt to this day. Digital animation programs such as Toon Boom and Flash take a lot from cel animation, mimicking many of the principles that were started in the cel era, and simplifying them with digital skeletons and joints to make animation more fluid, and streamlining the process as a whole. As the years go on and animation continues to evolve, cel animation's legacy will always be felt. The style and techniques that were developed and owned by those working in animation for the last century will forever be cemented in how animation is created today, even in an age where cel animation is no more. And now, we can appreciate these single frames as the one-of-a-kind works of art that they are, and reflect on the painstaking task that these animators went through to bring these pieces to life. Thank you for joining me on this look into the history, collecting, and preservation of animation cels. This video was one that I had wanted to make for a long time, but put off for quite a while due to not knowing exactly how I wanted to go about filming parts of my actual collection to be featured in the video. Luckily, I was able to wrap my brain around it, and it seemed to turn out okay. Animation cels are simply one of the many things I collect that I felt deserved a video on its own. I feel out of all the things I collect, it's the one that surprises the most people, as many don't even know about them as a collectible. I collect many things. I collect vinyl records, VHS tapes, retro video games, hell, I even collect guitars. I collect a lot of stuff. I'm just one of those people that gravitates towards collecting things, and cels have simply become another one of those things, but the fascinating and unique things about cels is their scarcity and intimacy. You can hold in your hand and have on your wall an original hand-painted piece of something you love, and that millions of others have seen only as a photograph on their TV. You can own the very cel that an animator hand-painted to bring the film or series to life. A one-of-a-kind piece of art that was directly responsible for its legacy today. We all watched a Disney movie, we all watched SpongeBob, Dragon Ball, whatever. There really isn't any closer you could get to the original series that you love than owning a cel from it, at least in my opinion. Anyone who has ever or will ever watch it has seen the very cel that you own, and no one else will ever own the cel that you have. I hope that I've been able to express why animation cels are so important, and why I think they're one of the most amazing forms of collectibles out there. Other YouTubers have made videos about animation cels, and I thought I'd go ahead and express my love for it. I actually got into animation cel collecting because of a YouTuber named Pat Mack. Mac had made quite a few videos discussing plush collecting, which is another rabbit hole I've since been obsessed with, and would eventually make a video on the importance of animation cell collecting, and, well, now we're here. This video, much like my Blair Witch Project video, was simply a passion project, and I don't expect this video to get many views at all, but that's okay. Sometimes I really just enjoy making a video where I can talk about something freely. Iceberg videos take quite a lot of research, but I do currently have 2 in the works, so you have those to look forward to if this wasn't really your thing. I've been a fan of animation for as long as I can remember, and cels really mean a lot to me, so thank you for listening to me ramble and probably repeat myself a bunch of times as I tried to express why I feel so strongly about animation cels. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a swell day.